The stories you are about to hear were never meant to be told together. They exist in separate towns, different decades, and unrelated case files, bound only by a shared decision to look away. Each one began as something small enough to ignore: a noise mistaken for weather, a missing person written off as a choice, a house labeled abandoned because it was easier than asking why no one stayed. These were not urban legends whispered for entertainment, but real moments documented in reports, recordings, and testimonies that still exist, unchanged, waiting for someone to read them closely enough. The first turning point always arrives quietly, disguised as routine, because nothing truly alarming announces itself at the moment it is found. It appears as a forgotten box pulled from a storage room, a mislabeled cassette in an evidence locker, a hard drive scheduled for deletion but paused by a flicker of curiosity. At the time, the discovery does not feel like the beginning of anything. It feels administrative, procedural, almost dull. Someone is simply doing their job, sorting, cataloging, clearing space. And yet this is where the stories begin to shift, because what was once dismissed is suddenly present again, no longer buried beneath excuses or time. In many cases, the item uncovered had already been seen before. It had been heard, read, or briefly examined years earlier, then categorized as irrelevant. A strange sound on a recording was labeled interference. A line in a report was chalked up to stress or miscommunication. A witness statement that didn't fit the prevailing narrative was preserved only because procedure demanded it be saved, not because anyone believed it mattered. These fragments survived not due to belief, but due to bureaucracy, locked away in archives where meaning slowly drained from them as memory faded. When revisited, the material does not change, but the context does. What once seemed insignificant now carries weight because the distance of time removes the urgency to explain it away. A modern listener hears the same sound and realizes it does not match static, weather, or mechanical error. A reader notices that a dismissed statement aligns too closely with details that were supposedly unknown at the time. Patterns emerge not because new evidence was added, but because the old evidence is finally being looked at without pressure to resolve the case quickly or protect reputations. This turning point is unsettling precisely because it exposes how much was always known. The discovery reveals that the truth was never entirely hidden, only deprioritized. The documents were filed correctly. The recordings were stored carefully. The physical evidence was photographed, tagged, and archived. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was fabricated. The system worked exactly as designed, preserving information without ever demanding it be understood. The horror lies in realizing that resolution was not blocked by lack of evidence, but by a collective willingness to accept incomplete explanations. Often, the rediscovered material contradicts the official conclusion in subtle ways rather than dramatic ones. Times do not align. Distances feel wrong. Voices overlap where only one person was meant to be present. A photograph captures a reflection that no report mentions. These discrepancies were easy to ignore when viewed alone, but impossible to dismiss once attention is paid. The turning point deepens as it becomes clear that someone, at some moment, noticed these inconsistencies and chose not to pursue them further, leaving behind a silent record of hesitation. What makes this stage so disturbing is its mundanity. There is no sudden revelation, no confession, no dramatic confrontation. Just the slow realization that the case was fragile from the beginning, held together by assumptions rather than certainty. The discovery forces a re-evaluation not only of the event itself, but of the people who investigated it. Were they overwhelmed, undertrained, or simply eager to move on? The preserved details suggest a decision was made to prioritize closure over clarity, comfort over accuracy. As the material is examined more closely, the implications widen. If this case contains overlooked warnings, how many others do as well? The discovery acts like a crack in glass, spreading outward, calling into question the reliability of entire archives. Each ignored detail becomes a symbol of how easily truth can be sidelined when it complicates narratives. The turning point is no longer about a single story, but about a system that quietly allows uncertainty to be sealed and labeled resolved. The unease intensifies when those involved realize that the rediscovered evidence does not point toward a neat alternative explanation. Instead, it opens doors to possibilities that are harder to confront. The noise on the tape suggests presence where none should exist. The journal entry implies awareness of danger before it was officially acknowledged. The missing file reference hints at material that was once reviewed but is now unaccounted for. The discovery does not answer questions. It multiplies them, transforming a closed case into an open wound. This moment also reintroduces the human element that had been stripped away by time. Names in reports become people again. Voices on recordings regain urgency. The discovery forces listeners and readers to experience the events as they unfolded, without the safety net of hindsight or official conclusions. The past feels suddenly close, uncomfortably so, as if the events were paused rather than finished, waiting for someone to press play again. The first turning point matters because it establishes that what follows is not speculation or rumor, but a re-examination of facts that were always present. It sets a tone of quiet dread, grounded in authenticity rather than exaggeration. The realization settles slowly, leaving behind a sense that the stories you are about to hear were never dormant, only unattended, their most disturbing details preserved patiently in the dark, waiting for the moment someone would finally look closely enough and notice that what had been dismissed as ordinary was anything but, and that the decision to ignore it may have been the most consequential act of all. Because once something is recorded and set aside, it gains the ability to resurface. Unchanged, long after the people who chose not to act have convinced themselves that the danger passed, the moment ended, the threat resolved, while the evidence remained exactly where it was left, intact, silent, and increasingly impossible to explain away as coincidence or error, especially when viewed now, in full, without the comfort of believing that everything important had already been seen. The second turning point emerges not from documents or recordings, but from people, and that is what makes it harder to dismiss. It begins when accounts that were once considered isolated start to overlap in ways that defy coincidence. At first, the similarities seem superficial. 2 witnesses mention a similar sound. 3 people describe a figure standing where no one should have been. A handful recall the same phrase being spoken in the dark. Individually, these details were easy to rationalize as memory distortion or shared cultural imagery, but placed side by side, they form a pattern that resists explanation. What makes this moment unsettling is that the witnesses have no connection to one another. They live in different towns, come from different backgrounds, and encountered the events years apart. There is no evidence they ever compared notes, no shared source from which their descriptions could have been influenced. Yet their testimonies align with unnerving precision. The same unnatural silence before the event. The same sensation of being watched without seeing anything. The same detail that feels too specific to be imagined independently. This convergence forces a reconsideration of the assumption that human memory is unreliable enough to explain everything away. In many of these cases, the witnesses were never treated as central figures. Their statements were taken as procedural necessities rather than meaningful contributions. Some were children at the time, their words discounted as imagination. Others were elderly, dismissed as confused. A few were outsiders passing through, their accounts deemed irrelevant to the local narrative. None were given reason to believe their observations mattered. And yet, years later, their voices begin to echo one another, as if describing the same moment from different angles. The turning point deepens when investigators or researchers notice that these shared details were not publicly known at the time the statements were made. The phrasing used by one witness appears in another's account long before it could have entered popular retellings. A physical detail mentioned in a private interview matches something later confirmed by evidence. These alignments strip away the comfort of attributing similarities to suggestion or exposure. The possibility emerges that the witnesses were responding to something external, something consistent enough to be experienced in the same way by different people. There is an instinctive resistance to this realization. Accepting it means acknowledging that something occurred which left a recognizable imprint on multiple observers. It suggests that the events were not random, not subjective, and not solely internal. This challenges the framework through which such cases are usually understood, where personal perception is treated as the weakest form of evidence. Here, perception becomes the connective tissue, the very thing that binds the stories together. As more accounts are revisited, the pattern grows clearer. The timing of events clusters around specific hours. The descriptions of movement follow the same unnatural rhythm. Even emotional reactions mirror one another, with witnesses reporting not panic or confusion, but a strange calm followed by delayed terror. These consistencies are not dramatic enough to feel cinematic, but they are precise enough to feel intentional. The effect is cumulative, each testimony reinforcing the last, until the sheer volume of alignment becomes impossible to ignore. What makes this turning point particularly disturbing is the realization that these witnesses were never meant to be compared. Their statements were filed separately, sometimes in entirely different jurisdictions. There was no mechanism in place to cross-reference them, no incentive to search for patterns across cases that were officially unrelated. The alignment exists only because someone chose to look beyond the boundaries that had been drawn around each story. The truth emerges not from a single revelation, but from the quiet act of listening to many voices at once. This moment also reframes the earlier dismissal of these accounts. What once appeared as inconsistency now reads as fragmentation. Each witness saw only a portion of the whole, describing it in the language available to them. The similarities suggest a shared source filtered through individual perspective. This does not make the accounts identical, but complementary, like pieces of a larger image that was never assembled at the time. The emotional weight of this realization is heavy. To accept the pattern is to accept that the witnesses were telling the truth as they experienced it, and that their truth was set aside not because it lacked credibility, but because it complicated the narrative. It forces a reckoning with how often discomfort is mistaken for implausibility. The stories were not unbelievable, they were simply inconvenient. As the second turning point settles in, it becomes clear that the mystery is no longer confined to a single event or location. It has spread across time and space, carried by people who never knew they were part of the same story. The repetition of impossible details suggests persistence, as though whatever caused these experiences was not bound by circumstance or chance. The witnesses did not seek one another out, yet their words find each other anyway, forming an unintended chorus. This convergence does not offer clarity or resolution. Instead, it replaces isolation with continuity. The fear is no longer that something strange happened once, but that it has been happening repeatedly, in the same way, to different people, without explanation or acknowledgement. The second turning point leaves behind a sense that these stories are not anomalies, but manifestations of something ongoing, something that leaves traces only in memory and testimony, subtle enough to be ignored individually, yet undeniable when gathered together, suggesting a presence or phenomenon that reveals itself not through spectacle, but through repetition, patiently waiting for enough voices to speak before it can no longer be dismissed as coincidence or error, because once multiple strangers describe the same impossible detail without knowing they are doing so, the mystery shifts from whether something happened to how long it has been happening and why it continues to surface in the same unsettling form across different lives, places, and years. The third turning point arrives when attention shifts away from testimony and paperwork and returns to the physical world, to the place itself, which had been declared finished with. Years may have passed since the events occurred, long enough for official interest to fade and for the location to be categorized as inactive, abandoned, or irrelevant. On paper, it exists only as an address tied to a closed case. In reality, it remains exactly where it always was, subject to weather, time, and neglect, waiting without intention or awareness, yet holding on to traces that refuse to disappear. The decision to revisit the location is rarely dramatic. It is motivated by curiosity rather than conviction, often framed as a formality rather than a search for answers. Expectations are low. At most, there might be structural decay, vandalism, or signs of nature reclaiming the space. Instead, what is found feels wrong in subtler ways. The building shows signs of maintenance where none should exist. Paths are worn where no one is supposed to walk. Doors that were documented as sealed are no longer fully closed, not forced open, but used. These details are unsettling because they do not announce themselves as evidence. They are easy to rationalize at first glance. Animals could have moved through. Locals might have trespassed. Weather could explain almost anything. Yet as the observations accumulate, the explanations begin to strain. Fresh footprints appear where the ground should be undisturbed. Debris has been rearranged deliberately rather than scattered. Objects inside the structure are displaced in ways that suggest purpose rather than chance. The deeper the examination goes, the clearer it becomes that the location has not been static. Time has passed, but not in the way it should have. Certain areas show recent use while others remain frozen in decay. Dust patterns indicate movement that occurred days ago, not years. Something has been present here, intermittently, carefully enough to avoid drawing attention, yet consistently enough to leave behind a rhythm of activity. What makes this turning point especially disturbing is how directly it contradicts official records. According to reports, the location was secured. Access was restricted. No one was meant to enter. And yet the physical evidence suggests otherwise, not through dramatic destruction, but through maintenance. Someone, or something, has been keeping parts of the place functional. Windows are not shattered. Water damage has been mitigated. A light fixture that should not work does. This creates a fracture between narrative and reality. The case was closed under the assumption that the location was no longer relevant, that whatever happened there was confined to the past. The signs of recent activity imply that the story did not end when attention moved elsewhere. The place itself has continued to participate, quietly, without acknowledgement. It becomes clear that closure was administrative, not actual. As observers move through the space, they often experience an inexplicable familiarity, as though the environment has retained an impression of what occurred. Certain rooms feel occupied despite being empty. Sounds travel in unnatural ways. Temperature shifts without clear cause. These sensations alone would not be meaningful, but when paired with physical evidence of recent presence, they become harder to dismiss. The location feels less like a backdrop and more like a witness that has been waiting to be questioned again. The turning point deepens when specific details from witness accounts align with what is found on site. A described obstruction is still there. A mark mentioned in a statement matches damage on a wall. A pathway through the area corresponds exactly to the route someone once claimed to have been forced to take. These alignments reinforce the idea that the witnesses were responding to a real, persistent environment rather than imagination or stress. There is also a growing sense that the location resists documentation. Equipment malfunctions. Recordings fail in specific areas. Batteries drain without explanation. These disruptions are subtle, never dramatic enough to prove intent, yet frequent enough to erode confidence. The place seems to exist just beyond reliable capture, leaving behind impressions rather than proof. This moment forces a re-evaluation of the role of location in the story. It is no longer simply where something happened, but where something continues to assert itself. The environment becomes an active element, shaping behavior and perception. The idea that a place can remain implicated long after an event is uncomfortable, challenging the belief that time neutralizes danger. As the visit concludes, the realization settles in that leaving does not resolve what has been uncovered. The physical signs will remain, whether documented or not. The location will continue to exist, accessible or not, carrying forward whatever has been occurring there in the absence of attention. The third turning point reframes the mystery as ongoing rather than historical, shifting the fear from what once happened to what is still happening, quietly, in places declared empty, overlooked, or finished, places that appear dormant only because no one is watching closely enough, and that reveal their true nature only when someone returns expecting nothing and instead finds evidence of continued presence, persistence, an intention that cannot be reconciled with the comfort of believing. That time, distance, or official closure can truly put an end to events that were never fully understood in the first place. The fourth turning point unfolds when attention turns toward authority, not as a source of answers, but as a source of contradiction. It begins with a statement that once carried weight simply because of who delivered it. A quote recorded in a press briefing. A conclusion written into an official summary. A reassurance offered at the end of an investigation that framed uncertainty as resolution. At the time, these words were accepted without resistance, repeated in reports, and used to justify the closing of the case. Only later, when revisited alongside the preserved evidence, do they begin to fracture. The contradiction is not immediately obvious. It reveals itself in small inconsistencies, a timeline that doesn't quite align with documented movements, a claim about conditions that conflicts with environmental data, an assertion of absence where records show presence. These discrepancies were easy to miss when the authority figure's explanation provided comfort and clarity. The human instinct to trust expertise softened scrutiny, allowing minor conflicts to be absorbed rather than challenged. As the evidence is laid out again, piece by piece, the gap between what was said and what was recorded widens. An official might have insisted that no unusual sounds were detected, yet an archived audio file contains distinct anomalies that were logged but never explained. A spokesperson may have stated that all individuals were accounted for, while a report quietly notes an unidentified figure observed at the edge of the scene. The contradiction does not suggest a single dramatic lie, but a pattern of selective framing, where inconvenient details were minimized or excluded to preserve a coherent narrative. What makes this turning point deeply unsettling is the realization that the authority figure likely knew about these inconsistencies at the time. The documents were available. The evidence was present. The choice was not between truth and ignorance, but between complexity and simplicity. Offering a clean conclusion required smoothing over elements that resisted explanation. In doing so, the official narrative became less about accuracy and more about manageability. The re-evaluation of these statements strips them of their protective quality. What once felt reassuring now feels evasive. Phrases meant to calm instead signal deflection. The authority's confidence, once interpreted as competence, begins to resemble finality imposed too early. The language used becomes suspect not because it is false, but because it is incomplete by design. This turning point also forces a reconsideration of motive. The contradiction does not automatically imply malice or conspiracy. In many cases, it points to institutional pressure, fear of public panic, or concern over liability. The authority figure may have believed they were acting responsibly by narrowing the narrative, by preventing speculation, by closing a case that threatened to spiral into uncertainty. Yet these justifications do not erase the consequences of omission. As scrutiny intensifies, it becomes clear that the official explanation shaped public perception more than evidence ever did. Once an authority declares something resolved, curiosity loses momentum. Alternative interpretations are dismissed as fringe. Witnesses who contradict the narrative are marginalized. The contradiction, when uncovered later, reveals how power can redirect attention away from unresolved truths without erasing them. The emotional impact of this realization is sharp. It undermines the assumption that oversight ensures thoroughness. The trust placed in official closure begins to feel misplaced. The contradiction suggests that the mystery was not only ignored by individuals, but actively constrained by the structure meant to investigate it. The story shifts from one of unexplained events to one of managed uncertainty. As the authority figure's past words are replayed, they take on a different tone. Assertions of certainty sound premature. Dismissals of concern feel calculated. The contrast between confident public statements and hesitant internal notes becomes impossible to ignore. The evidence shows that doubt existed, but was contained rather than explored. This turning point also reframes earlier dismissals of witnesses and locations. Their experiences were not discounted solely because they lacked credibility, but because they conflicted with the narrative being presented. The contradiction reveals a hierarchy of truth, where evidence that aligned with closure was elevated, and evidence that prolonged discomfort was sidelined. The most disturbing aspect of this moment is the realization that official contradiction does not end with the past. The same mechanisms persist. Statements are still made, conclusions still announced, narratives still shaped for consumption rather than completeness. The re-evaluation of one case becomes a lens through which to view many others, raising the possibility that unresolved truths are more common than acknowledged. The fourth turning point does not deliver revelation in the form of a confession or reversal. It delivers erosion. Trust wears away as the gap between authority and evidence becomes visible. The comfort once provided by official words dissolves, replaced by an awareness that resolution can be declared without being achieved, that confidence can mask uncertainty, and that the most unsettling mysteries are not those left unexplained, but those explained too quickly, their contradictions quietly preserved in records that wait patiently for someone to notice that what was said does not fully match what was known, and that the authority once relied upon to define reality may have instead narrowed it, leaving behind a version of events that feels stable on the surface while concealing fractures beneath, fractures that grow more apparent with time, attention, and the willingness to question whether closure was ever deserved or merely convenient. The fifth turning point arrives not with a new discovery, but with a realization that settles slowly and refuses to leave. By this stage, the evidence has been revisited, the witnesses reconsidered, the locations re-examined, and the official explanations exposed as incomplete. What remains is not a missing piece, but an unsettling pattern. The events did not conclude in any meaningful sense. They simply faded from attention. The cases were not solved so much as abandoned, left to rest in files that suggested finality without ever achieving it. This realization reframes everything that came before. The language of closure, stamped dates, and formal conclusions now appear as markers of disengagement rather than resolution. Investigation stopped not because there was nothing left to pursue, but because continuing would require confronting uncertainty that offered no clean answers. The machinery of inquiry slowed, then halted, while the underlying phenomena continued beyond the edges of documentation. What makes this turning point particularly chilling is the recognition that the same conditions which allowed these cases to be set aside are still in place. Time passes. Resources shift. Attention moves elsewhere. Without sustained scrutiny, even the most troubling mysteries can be reclassified as finished. The realization is not that something went wrong once, but that this process is routine, embedded in how unresolved events are handled. As this understanding takes hold, the stories begin to feel less like isolated anomalies and more like examples of a recurring failure. Each case contains a moment where pursuit could have continued, where questions remained open, where evidence resisted explanation. Each also contains a point where momentum was lost, where curiosity gave way to practicality. The decision to stop investigating was rarely dramatic. It happened through silence, reassignment, and the quiet passage of time. The fifth turning point also brings an awareness of persistence. The phenomena described did not depend on investigation to exist. Whatever caused the experiences, the sightings, the sounds, or the disturbances was not resolved by official disengagement. The patterns suggest continuity rather than conclusion. Events recur. Details repeat. Locations remain active. Witnesses continue to come forward, often unaware of the history that preceded them. This continuity introduces a more unsettling possibility that the act of stopping investigation may have allowed the phenomena to persist unchallenged. Without documentation, without acknowledgement, without pressure to explain, the events exist in a kind of shadow, real enough to affect those who encounter them, but not enough to demand collective response. The absence of scrutiny becomes a form of permission. Emotionally, this realization is heavy because it implicates everyone. The failure is not confined to authorities or investigators. It extends to systems, communities, and audiences who accepted closure without question. The fifth turning point removes the comfort of distance. It suggests that the boundary between the stories and the present is thin, maintained only by attention and memory. The idea that these events simply stop being investigated also challenges the assumption that danger diminishes with time. Instead, it implies that danger can become normalized, folded into the background until it no longer triggers alarm. The unfamiliar becomes familiar through repetition and neglect. What once demanded answers becomes part of the landscape, quietly endured rather than confronted. This realization also casts earlier evidence in a harsher light. The preserved recordings, the aligned testimonies, the active locations, and the contradictory statements now appear not as fragments of a failed investigation, but as signposts of an unfinished one. The story was never concluded. It was paused indefinitely, leaving behind traces that continue to surface whenever someone looks too closely. The fifth turning point does not offer revelation in the traditional sense. There is no singular truth uncovered, no final explanation that ties everything together. Instead, there is a recognition of absence, of something that should have happened but did not. The investigation should have continued. The question should have deepened. The discomfort should have been confronted. Instead, the process ended prematurely, leaving the phenomena untouched. As this understanding settles, the fear shifts again. It is no longer centered on what occurred in the past, but on what may still be occurring beyond the margins of awareness. The stories become warnings rather than mysteries. They suggest that some phenomena rely on neglect to survive, that they exist not because they are unstoppable, but because they are ignored. The fifth turning point leaves behind an unsettling sense of responsibility. To acknowledge that the events did not end is to accept that they could be revisited, re-examined, and perhaps interrupted. It raises the question of how many similar stories exist, waiting in archives, dismissed not because they lack substance, but because they demand more attention than anyone was willing to give. The realization is quiet but enduring. These stories persist not in spite of being forgotten, but because of it, lingering in the spaces left behind when investigation gives way to indifference, continuing without resolution, without explanation, and without closure, shaping the lives of those who encounter them while the rest of the world moves on, believing that what is no longer discussed has somehow ceased to exist, when in reality it has simply been left alone long enough to continue. Unseen, unchanged, and unchallenged.